You had me at Jeff Goldblum and Chaps right there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. I am your host, Jeff. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Alan and Mona are on assignment this week, so it is just me, and I figured, I don't know if people are ready for a full 50 minutes to an hour of just me, so I brought in my friend Adam to come and be a co-host with me. So Adam, say hello to all of our listeners.
Hello, all of the listeners of the Irenicast, and that includes me. I am a listener, so hello to myself, I guess.
So not only do we have a guest co-host once again for 2 weeks in a row, but we do have a fan of the show. So,
well, I'm a listener.
Oh.
No, I'm a fan too, for sure. Absolutely.
All this is kind of coming together, and I asked Adam to be on, and he graciously agreed. So Adam, tell us a little bit about yourself and why I feel that you're qualified to be here in the studio.
Goodness gracious. All right. Well, let's see here. I'm someone who I feel like has somewhat of a similar faith experience as you all. I actually currently work in a Christian organization, but I've had a similar path of kind of growing up within the church in what I would consider a more conservative church, and then now, having all these questions, or kind of on the other side somewhat of going through some bigger questions about faith. What does it mean? And now kind of living on what I would say is the other side, or maybe a different place from evangelicalism. I live close to you somewhat, so that I feel like is a good qualifier for being here. And we've hung out somewhat a bunch before. I don't know, has it been like 2, 3 years, 4 years that we've known each other? Almost five.
Almost five, yeah.
Yeah, so we met at at a church we were going to, and I was thinking the other night, like, I don't remember when you and I met. I know that our wives met before I think we did, perhaps, or at least knew each other.
I'm not sure either. I think it might have been the first, because we had a group, a young professionals group, not college and not real adults, apparently. So.
That's right. We don't fit. You don't have kids yet. You're not important to the church. Just kidding. But,
Exactly. Well, it feels that way sometimes. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But yeah, so we've known each other for almost 5 years. Kind of the catalyst for this podcast was Mona, Alan, and I having these conversations. And fortunately, Adam is one of those people that has been a part of those conversations. And then also the two of us have had conversations like that at various different times, really trying to figure out where we are and what we're doing and all that kind of stuff. So obviously this is going to be a little different of an episode because we are without two of the primary personalities that have driven the show thus far, but they will be back. This isn't a permanent thing. This is just life circumstances getting in the way. So this week, because of that, we are going to talk about deconstruction. So we're going to talk about some stuff that we've shared so far, but kind of bits and pieces over the various episodes that we've had, but really just zero in on what was that process of deconstruction like for us? What was the process from moving to feeling this way about faith and the church and Bible, and now being on the other end of that, and maybe even not on the other end, but trying to create a space for how do you take apart some of those old views and build new ones and not just abandon everything altogether. So on the other side of the music, we will be discussing our journeys of deconstruction. This week, deconstruction. And for those of you that may not have used that term, but basically what we're talking about, like I talked about at the top of the show, is this idea of how do you move from one set of beliefs to another set of beliefs without abandoning the whole thing in general. And I think this is a question that we've all, at least that are associated with this show, have wrestled with, and we know many of you listening have as well. So hopefully as we kind of share our stories and then maybe even spider off into some of our frustrations or places we still feel we haven't reached yet, that this will be an encouragement to you in your journey for settling, at least temporarily, into some kind of new belief set and then hopefully advancing on into a new one. So Adam, tell me a little bit about your faith journey and how that process of deconstruction started for you.
Yeah, so for me growing up, I was one of the only people. I lived in a really small town, and I was one of the only people my age that was actually still going to church. And so it's been somewhat of a journey that's mostly, at least started out, just is my own, like in my head, or like what I was thinking and believing. And then as I got into college, and then after college, it's become a little bit more ingrained, or a part of a community experience. And then now it's somewhat back to, I guess it's experience now that is between like my wife and I mostly, is where we're having a lot of the more deep conversations and questions that we may or may not feel are safe to have in a community experience again. So it started out in this place where I was totally, I'm by myself, and because I was the only one in the quasi youth group that we had, it was fine to have any sort of question that you wanted. Didn't matter at all. They weren't afraid, that, you're going to make someone else lose their faith. But now as a part of a larger organization, there's these questions about, well, how do you hold on to stuff? How far can you think? How far can you question and still be considered in? And I think that just that principle on itself makes me feel like, there's something that inside me reacts against that. Like when I look at Jesus, when I look at the stories that I see in the gospel, I don't see a sense of, okay, here's all these lines that we're going to draw around to say, well, okay, you're in, you're out. And so, yeah, that's been a major part of it for me. The irony in all this for me is it's like, as I'm drawn to these really kind of broad or really wide ideas that I think can pull people or seem to pull people outside of a faith experience, I'm also extremely fascinated with like theology. I like to learn. I just went to like an 8-day class on systematic theology 2. And this is the first class I've ever taken. And I was really nervous going into it that I was like, oh, this is going to be terrible. This is exactly not what I'm interested in. But yet it was so refreshing and intriguing to me because it was these deep, deep questions of wrestling with, how do we even understand these things? Like actually really deep into the tradition of Christianity is, how do we answer these really complex questions when we get to wondering, what it means to articulate even what faith is? So it's been a little bit of both inside and outside of what I think are the kind of normal church parameters.
So for you, it started as a mental exercise, things that were happening internally that you were processing through. Were there any external forces or relationships or interactions that kind of piled up on that caused you to even further think that the things that you were thinking almost validated them in a sense?
Yeah, I think for me, a big part of that process was, growing up in a really tiny, small town where you're really aware of the context you're in. Like what life includes is somewhat like visible. It's all there, and that's how we understand. And, our theology, everything kind of fits within that system. And I think it still works to a degree. Like when I go home, I think, this still makes sense here. But then I go to college, and it's not even to like a big city. I mean, where we live now, it's not that big of a place. But you start to interact with people that have, they come from different backgrounds, come from different faith experiences, even within the community of faith, right? And all of a sudden, my context doesn't fit that. Or the framework for what I kind of base all my beliefs on kind of reaches its limits. Whether that's, the philosophy class that you take or the science class or whatever. But for me, mostly it was, I think a pivotal moment was I was in the inner city of Los Angeles on this project, a Christian kind of, we're going to go in and be in the inner city and try to love the inner city. And what was great about that experience was there was a lot of looking at the complexities of what are all the dynamics involved here. And it was a sister and brother that were part of our team who I had just met in this project. And they were both from El Salvador. And it was just a confluence of like conversations that we were having and a movie or two that we had watched about Romero and some other folks. And just being an experience of like for the first time in my life living for 6 weeks in the inner city, which, as you know, the choice that I got to make is crazy, right? But like to get to even have that privilege, but where it was just like, oh my gosh, my worldview is so tiny. And if all the things I believe about faith kind of only make sense in that worldview, then what do you do when that worldview breaks? When the framework breaks down, what do you do? And so it's been mostly through relationships with people who either live in a different framework, I would say, or who live by a different framework, where I've been mostly challenged and realized, oh, well, if I believe what I believe about God, then these people have to fit too, or this idea has to fit as well. And in my current context, it doesn't. Not current now, but yeah.
I feel like maybe the reason that a lot of people don't even enter into the exercise of deconstruction is because of those reasons. Because everything that we build, within our worldview, our emotions, our theology, everything we build in a particular context. We build in this church, in this town, in this moment. And if you stay in those places, it's easy to not even take the time to think that maybe I'm wrong, maybe this needs rethinking. And for me also, and I know I've shared on several, especially our very first episode, which there's a link in the show notes if you're just new listening. You can listen to myself and my other co-hosts about our journeys away from evangelicalism, but I think we didn't really touch a lot on the process and how that worked. We talked about some of the catalysts that pushed us away and where we are now, but some of the middle ground we kept muddy. So I think this is a good conversation for us to have. But anyway, one of the big things for me, like you said, was putting myself in other contexts, whether it was even a youth group missions trip, even though I look back at some of those trips and I'm like, but I'm still so thankful for those opportunities because they took me out of that place and allowed me to rebuild some stuff in other contexts and realizing, wow, there has to be more flexibility with the things that I believe, because if not, then if I'm interjected into a new situation, it's not going to fit, or I'm just going to be isolated. Because I think the process of deconstruction, especially when most of the stuff is torn down, is very lonely because it's hard not to feel like you're the only one thinking these things, especially when you're in a context like all of us have been that's so sure and so right and so 100% about everything that we believe and teach is right and there's no room for error or moving forward. Would you say that that's kind of been your experience too?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's, like that, it's the outside pressure of, whatever you want to say, just the changing culture, society, whatever. But, postmodernism is allowed. I mean, really, it's the age of the internet, right? Like, not only is it that we have access to everything, but, it's just constant. We consume it. And so, whereas I think, growing up in a small town, and it's not just small town stuff. I mean, people I feel like you could have the exact same experience in a massive city. Absolutely. Where it's like, oh, this block, this is so much that you kind of have to define. But like, growing up, you could choose not to read certain parts of the newspaper maybe, or maybe you didn't get certain, it's like, there wasn't this continual stream of like, this is what the rest of the world is. When something happens in Darfur, when something happens, even in the next city over or across the world, like we don't have any kind of, pressure to think about it or to handle it. And you can kind of shut it out.
Yeah. And it's real easy to stay, like you were saying, even in a larger area, to stay in a block or whatever. When we were youth pastors in an area that was pretty small, but it was just a cluster of small areas with little gaps in between. And we had students in our youth group who lived in this town, and it was only 15, 20-minute drive to get to the beach. 15, 20 minutes, and had never been to the beach.
Wow.
And they're teenagers, and they live 20 minutes away. Like, it's so easy to just be in a place and let that place dictate your whole worldview and then impose that kind of thing on the rest of the world around it. But then when that starts getting shook, I feel like we have two reactions. We either just hold on and isolate even tighter or begin to deconstruct. And I think the hard part is once we start deconstructing, I don't think there's enough people talking about this process because it's hard to rebuild again.
Yeah.
Did you have moments where you felt like, am I ever going to rebuild this? Like, am I totally abandoning everything that I believe now?
Oh, for sure. I think there are moments definitely where when you decide, okay, I'm going to let this idea in, it's kind of like no going back. It's like you're falling off of a cliff at some level because, it's the irony to me is that it's like that's the faith journey, though. I mean, it's like you're trusting in something bigger or beyond. And so it's built in. And I think maybe that's the difference that I experience from some friends that I know who in the same process, they end up kind of abandoning or, chucking. I don't know if they would call it abandoning, but they would say maybe giving up or growing beyond their faith. For me, I have multiple experiences where thankfully, God willing, I was somehow it was through a Christian or a faith community where that process was led. Like, some of the big examples for me, so the inner city experience, in the organization I'm a part of, they did an amazing job of just jumping into the complexity of like race relationships and reconciliation. What does that even look like? But there was a willingness to say, okay, well, we, because of who God is or because of who we believe Jesus to be, we're going to engage in this because we think there's not just that because we think God's doing that and headed that direction, but we can trust that God will kind of help sort out the mess as we go. And I just think, well, some of my friends, they didn't have a community that accepted that. You know, it was the community itself felt like, oh no, if we take this step forward or if we open up to this idea or whatever, the whole thing's going to fall apart. So I think that happens it happens at an organizational level. And I think it happens, I mean, in me, it happens. I mean, that's, to me, I kind of think of that as like ego, or like Richard Rohr kind of has like true self, false self stuff. And I think of that of like, oh, I got to protect my own identity is really what it comes down to, right? Like if I can protect my identity, or if our church can protect our church's identity from the secular, horrible, whatever thing, then that's just what we have to do. We have to build a defense and a wall or something, because that's what God needs us to do, to be the last standing, you know, whatever it may be.
We need to defend the infinite being of the universe, because God is super sensitive, and we don't want to see God shed tears. So for you, what were some of the fears attached to allowing yourself to ask those questions? For me, and initially, and if a couple episodes back we talked about heaven and hell, for me initially, one of those fears was, I'm going to go to hell.
Sure.
You know, if I'm that, because like you said, it was all presented as, if you don't believe this, then that means you can't believe this, and there was no room for nuance. It was this very domino, you know, this thing of dominoes. And I remember one of the things that really, really helped me, and I think this is probably true for a lot of recovering evangelicals, is a lot of Rob Bell's writings were very important for me, especially his first book, Velvet Elvis.
I was just thinking of this analogy, right?
Yeah.
You like the brick wall thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Go there. That's
how we build our theology on a brick wall, and if you take a brick out, then it demeans the structure, and it takes away its balance. But if you look at it more of, so, you know, you're not going to lean up against a wall that's broken, and it becomes more and more fragile the more bricks you take away, as opposed to a trampoline that's held together by all these different springs. And if there's one spring missing or two springs missing, or even just a couple, like, you're not worried about jumping on that, because it's got more structure and it has more flexibility to be able to take springs out and replace them with new ones. And that was really freeing for me to feel like, okay, it's not a domino effect. And it kind of relieved some of that fear, but it still was there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember the moment I'm reading that book, and for me, it's mostly been about, if I can come up with a framework that will, you know, or imagine even something to where this stuff still fits, then I feel safe. You know, so it's like, yeah, that particular image came to mind of, oh yeah, I can jump on a thing, and if it's gonna, you know, a trampoline, and if it's, you know, flexible, that's a much better idea. And I think there's a huge difference. I mean, like my parents, I feel like their generation, I mean, they've gone through the, you know, the deconstruction of modernism, and it's like all the things that they kind of understood. Well, if you do this, it's going to lead to, you know, security. Like having that lost, I could understand that if you go through that, you're going to be really skeptical, you know, of, you know, just the continual deconstruction of stuff. But I think for me, having grown up in it, it's like, this is kind of normal. You just do this. You deconstruct things. We're all suspicious of any kind of authority. And then time and time, you know, thanks to the internet, thanks to everything we know, we can see, oh yeah, I can come up with a million examples of why this particular rule or law or whatever it might be doesn't make sense. But so what that leads to, though, is, and we talked about this a little bit, but like the idea of, so then what? Though, I mean, because it gets kind of fun to just go and, I can deconstruct this. Well, I'll take, you know, if there's no sacred cows, I feel kind of freer. And it can even become like a, you know, like a reverse thing to where before, you know, my ego is protected by if I, you know, have this rule and this law and believe X, Y, and Z in the right thing. Well, then it can just, you know, flip to the other side of like, well, if I can disprove X, Y, and Z, or if I can be, you know, just so on the other end of nothing matters and we don't have to hold on to anything. It's kind of the same reality of, okay, well, I can protect my ego because now nothing has anything to say to me.
Yeah. I just came up in my mind, I'm thinking, and this is going to sound super nerdy and childish, but I was thinking Minecraft, where I've played Minecraft and I'm, you know, tearing down this building because I want to rebuild a new one. And then I realize, oh no, it's dark time and the zombies are coming and I have no place for shelter. Yeah. And that feeling is, obviously that's a silly analogy, but I think that feeling represents that idea of like, I've questioned all these things. And now if I really ask myself, I don't know what I believe. And I think belief is important. It gives us something to hold on to. I mean, not even just belief, but just something that we can hang our hat on that we feel as though we are secure in. But yeah, so then when we're in that place of, man, now, because when we talk about like things like when I read that book from Rob Bell, Velvet Elvis, that was comforting. Not only did it give me a new way to think of things, but it felt like, oh, someone else is asking these questions. I'm not alone. And that was also very important. But then practically, sometimes I did feel pretty alone and nothing to hold on to, and moments where I'm reading, I don't know, the Bible or talking to someone about faith and thinking in my mind and my heart, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't even know what I think about that.
Well, and I think that the alone thing is huge for me too, in the sense of, so I've continued to decide to be a part of a faith community, be involved in a church, and it's when I find random people, usually they're on the edges, or even are that group we're a part of. There are people in there who I knew were having the same kind of questions, but who hadn't completely like chucked the whole faith thing. They're still engaged, and so even knowing that there are people there, but most of those people I feel like end up leaving the church, and maybe necessarily for a while or even for a long time. And I don't know if, God willing, there's some kind of new thing that they create. Awesome. But in the meantime, it feels like, especially within, so I grew up in a more conservative, now I'm going to a more progressive or liberal church. And they're really, in neither one am I finding people our age who are like, okay to stick around, just because I think folks can't, just get sick of the like, okay, we know this isn't real, or we know this isn't true, or these are just frameworks to keep an institution going sometimes. I mean, and every church is different, sure. But for the most part, the churches I've experienced, there's a sense of, you can tell at some level, and I think maybe this is it, just our generation is able to sense this a little bit more. The holding the structure of the organization together is more important ultimately than the things that we're believing in. I mean, we'll try to think those are the same, that, oh yeah, no, we believe this and this is what makes us our structure. But then at the end of the day, you're able to go, no, really, it's the church building or the church people that you're most,
Well, and it's amazing how quickly in church communities, the structure and the building becomes so intertwined and stuck with their theology that if you're just changing something cosmetic, you put people in a position where they feel like you're changing their theology, or where you're taking away one of those bricks from their wall, which has always been a frustration for me. Like, I'm just challenging the structure. This structure or this thing has nothing to do with who God is or your theology, but you've married it so much that it's hard for people to make that delineation.
Yeah, and people get to a place of where it's genuine. Like, they genuinely care, they genuinely love, they genuinely want to be following, the tenets of the faith at some level. But that line for them gets drawn, for different people gets drawn in so many different places. And in some ways, I feel like the faith experience can become more about how convicted or how, passionate do I feel about this particular thing. And when that kind of starts to slip, then there's a fear of like, so it's not even just the structure. It could even be just personally like, oh, I'm not feeling as passionate about that anymore. I mean, to me.
And then you have certain communities that would chastise you for that as you're becoming lukewarm.
Oh, yeah.
And,
No, exactly.
Yeah.
I think of it kind of like marriage or whatever. It's like, oh, we've lost that amazing, if you have a marriage, if you got married and you have this like, I mean, this wasn't exactly mine and my wife's experience, but, they talk about like a honeymoon period at the beginning. We were in the midst of all this transition and all sorts of stuff. So, I think we didn't really have a honeymoon period until I don't know if we had, but it was like the first 3 years were horrible. It was really difficult. But from like, kind of standard, this idea of if you, that initial love or that excitement, and then it's like, oh, when that starts to fade to real life, chores and or even just in friendship, maybe like the first you meet someone and you're like, oh, hey, they're amazing and we kind of jive. And then later on, it's like, oh, we have to work at this. I'm not sure. I think churches are attempting to try to figure out how to do that. That's why I think in the Protestant church, there's a little bit of a, I don't know, reformation is not the right word to use, but like, resurgence or at least like a beginning to see, oh, hey, like spiritual disciplines, that sounds good. All this stuff can go in the wrong direction too, of course, but they're like a sense of we need to care for the soul of people and the reality that the passion, the excitement, the rules, whatever, are going to lose their luster, and that's normal.
So for you, what would have been important and valuable for you during your deconstruction from a church perspective to make you feel like this was a normal thing and you were celebrated and lifted up in that process, as opposed to feeling like if you exposed too much to that process, you would be isolated?
That's good. I feel like there's maybe two different responses. One, if I was still in the church that I grew up in, I think where their response, was, don't ask too many questions, or it's okay if you ask some questions, but here's the book that give you the exact right answers, and they're mostly by older white men. So, in that context, it would just be nice to know that there were other people in the church who said, yeah, we we had those. We thought of those questions. We struggled in the same way. And but we got to the place where we figured out the answers. Maybe they would be able to say something about, and we eventually, somehow integrated that into our faith, those questions, those doubts. And I think in some ways, the reason I stayed involved in church is because I've seen that somewhat in people, or just kind of intuitively imagine that that's what's happened for them. And so for me, it's mostly been actually, and the reason why I think we go to the church that we go to now is it's in seeing people who are in their 70s and 80s even, who are still, like, they're still doing it. They're still following Jesus, and they've gone through some serious stuff. Like, it's not some like, well, here are the 3 things we believe, and that's it. And for some people, maybe that's true. But for some folks I know they've gone through divorce, they've gone through affairs, they've gone through, death of a child, the rejection of, a child, or that they've 30 years ago dealt with the fact that their kids were gay, and like, how do we handle this in a faith community? That they're still around is such a huge testimony. I think that makes me feel like, okay, there's space here. Because I'm sure it was if it's as difficult as it is now to have some of these conversations, I can't imagine 30, 40 years ago what it was like. So they, I guess, are the people that make me feel like, okay, well, there's hope.
Yeah. When you mentioned that idea of, like, when you're asking those questions, someone come up to you and saying, here's a book and all that kind of stuff. For me, I think what have been helpful is alleviating the pressure that I felt I needed to find an answer.
Yeah.
No one ever came to me with a question. When I finally did muster the courage and say, all right, because most of my life in the church, well, half of my life in the evangelical church was either I was an adolescent in youth group or I was in youth ministry, from youth leader to youth pastor. So I rarely had any experience just as a congregation member, which maybe the church is more forgiving of just a regular congregation member than someone who's on staff. But when I did muster up the courage to talk to someone, it was always like, oh, well, be careful, and then here's resources, or here's what I think, and here's the answer you should land on. And I can't remember once where someone said, oh, that's interesting. Well, there's different ways you can think about that, and different places you can land on. Here's this person thinks this, and this person thinks that. Go to those places. And I think at least my college experience for my theology undergrad, that was helpful for me to be in a place that said, here's what everyone kind of believes, and here's how you can maneuver through it, as opposed to read this book and this person says this and this person said that. That person's wrong, but this person's right, so follow them. And that would have made the deconstruction process for me feel a lot less overwhelming and lonely and just big if there was room to be wrong, or room to recognize that there is no wrong, that there's just, and I know some people that might listen to that say, well, there is right and wrong, and da-da-da-da. That's another show, but I mean that in a general sense, and that there's freedom to not toe your denominational line. There's freedom to not agree with the pastor of your church.
Yeah, that makes me think too how much there's, like, if I was just given the freedom to have your own faith, maybe, like, is it really what it is? Yeah, if someone gives you a book that, I've had conversations with, I work for, like, a student ministry with different students who, I'd show them some book that I was interested in. They'd look on the back and see, like, it was endorsed by somebody, right? And then, like, oh, my pastor says we can't. It's like, it's not even written by that person. But really, nobody says this, but you're able to recognize in that they're afraid that I can't handle my own faith, basically. That this isn't something that's just me. Like, oh, if I give you a book that actually might, give an opinion outside of the denominational view, or even the Christian worldview, right? Like that, oh no, they're going to lose it. I think that's part of it too. There's just such a fear of, oh, we're gonna lose the faith. And I don't know. It's some of that just comes down to, like, your perspective on what is God even doing in the world. Like, is the church the last standout for the godly people, and it's all going to get wiped away, and so just hold on to your whatever. But it just seems like, well, there's plenty in the gospel stories in the Bible that I feel like paints a completely different picture. I don't think Jesus is worried about whether or not the systematic level of theological stuff is understood by the guy coming up to him to ask him, hey, can you heal my kid? So Jesus seems to trust people a little bit more than I feel like the current church does.
That's really good. I think that we could talk about. Man, that could lead to a whole show about just power structures and how that affects. Because I'm probably with you in the sense that, or maybe I just have to believe that it's always well-meaning, and sometimes it's just the structure influences. But I'm sure there are some people out there that are power grabbing in any way that they can to manipulate or shape or whatever people.
Oh
believe.
yeah.
But,
Well, and I think that you get like promoted for that, or or we just affirm the confidence, so much. The church gets so excited about a really dynamic, and I'm all for it. Like, so, I struggle with this myself. Like, I'm not the kind of leader that's going to step out and be this crazy visioning, like, here's where we're going, and we're going to take everyone in that direction. And so, just personality wise, then, for my own ego, I'm suspicious of those people, right? Because the way that they lead doesn't affirm me. So again, I'm just back to self-affirming. But recently someone gave me this great model, this idea of like leading from different positions, like where there's this hike that we go on at this one camp that we do. And it's a pretty serious hike. It's like a good steep, probably about 1,000, 1,500 feet up. You're right on the coast, then you go all the way up to the top of the mountain, and then you like walk down this road. And it's a good 2.5 hour hike. And you go, and there's like the people that are leading in front who just charge up the hill, with the college students who are the athletes and other folks who are just, we're gonna make it to the top in 20 seconds, they're racing up the top. And then you have people in the middle who are, just the normal, like the people that sustain the stuff. They just kind of go, they're in the middle, and you have leadership there too. So you have leaders up front, you have leaders in the middle who are making sure everyone still knows which direction to go and how to get up there, kind of containing the structure. But then you have people in the back who are like carrying the first aid kit, who are walking with the people who probably shouldn't have even been on the hike. They're in flip-flops. They've never gone on a hike in their life, and they're falling apart. And it's just, so I find myself appreciating that space a little bit more. It's bent to my, my personality and my experience too. But the church, I feel like, gets really excited about the front leaders. And we affirm somewhat the middle people, but we don't really know what to do with the people in the back if you're not going to get on board.
Well, that's even reflective if you think about it in the way that we retell stories of the Bible. Be like a David. Well, there was only one David out of a couple million people, and there's only one Moses out of a couple million people. And yeah, that's true. Maybe I have never thought of it that way, but that underlining, unless you're like this person, you don't measure up. And like you said, it's not explicitly said, and I don't think anyone in their right mind, hopefully, would say that, like, you have to be this. But it's certainly easy to come to that conclusion when something contrary is not said. And then, how much does that add to the deconstruction process? Well, that person never doubted. Abraham had faith and just left, and we associate our questions with doubt, which means we're losing our faith, as opposed to questions as a healthy way to build our faith.
Yeah.
And shield us from doubt in a way, because it gives us the freedom to ask questions and work through them, as opposed to being afraid all the time.
Yeah, there's this huge shift for me that happened between seeing faith as like certainty, or at least like hardcore conviction about a particular thing, as if those are synonymous. And then the idea, when that changed to, no, faith is like risk. Like, actually, if you're going to exercise faith, it requires no certainty, not no certainty, but if everything was certain, then you wouldn't require any faith. Like, if it's the law of physics or the law of this, then there's no faith involved in that. It is what it is, without you or with you. But for, to actually have faith means that there has some sort of risk or some sort of, gap that you're not certain of. I don't know exactly what, how I would define belief and all those things. Who knows? But I'm willing to deconstruct that a little bit. And then there's space then. And I'm not worried about, am I lining up exactly with this or that? Now, I do think that over time, like, I deconstruct a little bit here, I deconstruct a little bit here. But then I kind of, create my own frame from there. And I think maybe just the difference is before, the framework was kind of required. Everyone needs this in order to be on the right path or whatever. But then afterwards, well, it's a framework that at one level maybe is overly individualistic, at the sense of, well, this is working for me. I kind of feel like, okay, that's nice, but what about, a community? How does that work? And so it's mostly been, I think, in seeing, okay, how can I still pursue community, or how can I still, engage in this outside of my own mind? And that's where some of the reconstruction stuff, I think, starts to happen.
What about the other end of it? Like, I think we've spent some time talking about how it affected us personally, some things that we did to kind of move forward, or some things that would have been very helpful for us to move forward in that deconstruction process. But what about looking back, now that you've deconstructed, and trying to relate with people who knew you when you were that, and now have seen where you're at? And sometimes you can kind of tell in the way that they look at you, like, oh my gosh, I need to pray for them. they've lost their faith and they're not even Christian anymore. Sometimes they're just very explicit about it. So how have you maneuvered through the aftermath of once you've sort of started to reconstruct how to work with people that feel as though, especially people that are close to you, that feel as though you've lost your faith in some way?
So before, I feel like we all have to agree on this and this and this, and I'm on the inside because I agree with everyone. And then I move out of that, and now it's like, okay, well, how do I engage with those people? But I feel like I'm just as tempted then to be like, no, they need to think just like I do. That they have to just have the same, more progressive, or they have to be just as open or something. And it's the same feeling. It's before we all agree, and now, well, I think something different. So now you all have to agree with me, and it's just kind of perpetuating. So at one level, when I interact with folks, if I try to pay attention to that in myself. Like, is this me just trying to justify like where I'm at? Do I need them to really know that I think something completely different than them? And it gets really like gray between how deceptive am I being? Like, do I need to say, well, actually, I really disagree with what you just said? And so I wrestle with that. I struggle through that all the time. So in some ways, there are people who I think they don't know that they should be praying for me, maybe because I don't allude to something. It's like, I just don't need to go there. I don't need to have some of those conversations. What I believe and where I'm at doesn't need to be dependent on whether or not those people, the people that think differently, affirm me or not. And some of that's come because I can begin to appreciate, well, you know what, there's not an order here. It's not like I've progressed beyond or anything like that. I'm just in a different place, where they're at maybe really good for them. Like, I'll come in contact with some folks that like went to the same high school as the only high school that I went, that was in the area where I grew up. And they're like, when we were, in high school together, they weren't Christians and they were, out there doing the bad stuff or whatever. And I've seen some of them like now are, I'll see on Facebook or other places where they're starting to, they have some sort of faith. Somehow they got into the faith community. And if I look at it, I would say, well, the kind of faith that they're engaging in is much more conservative than where I'm at now, and we're the same age. But it's so good for them, like where they're at, like it's just this beautiful thing. And so at some level, being okay with the fact that people are, at a whole spectrum of places. But when it comes to like people that might just directly confront me about stuff, oh man, it's just hard. And that's part of why I think I'm drawn to some of the systematic or theological stuff, because I feel like, well, no, okay, I'll go there if you want. Let's talk about that. You want to get, very theological, that's okay. I just feel like that when you start to go that direction too, you realize they're extremely smart, brilliant, well-read people from different backgrounds who come to completely different beliefs about particular things. And they're just that reality, I think. So, the initial question is like, how do you get there? Like, read a lot. I wish someone had said, no, it's okay. And here's 7 books that you probably would never pick up that are really going to mess you up, and then trusted that I could have handled that. And I think, in personal relationship, you can kind of tell, or at least hopefully have a better idea if people are there or not. But yeah, ultimately it was, seeing the fact that, so what I mean to say is I can usually find someone, an author, I think, that they would agree with and say, well, look, this person actually is saying this, which goes against kind of what you're thinking. And that's when I'm feeling more arrogant or prideful. I like to throw back. Oh, well, actually, Tertullian also said this. So what do you do with that?
There's some satisfaction in turning around a beloved character and putting them in a place to squirm a little bit.
Yeah. That's and that fuels my ego as much as being certain about something does too. So,
and I think that's a really good point. Is it when you're on the other side, or when you feel you have a better grasp for where you stand, it's hard not to want everyone to jump forward. But there are some people that they just can't make the jump from no acceptance to full acceptance. And really, how do we guide people through the process? And then how do we have patience? And how do we recognize when someone is genuinely mulling over it, or someone is just choosing to close themselves out, and creating that process? Because I think for all of us, we would have really liked that space to figure things out and to ask questions and not feel like we were chastised for those questions. Because generally, I would say that people are genuine and they're trying to figure things out and they want to do good and they want to treat people well, but they have a lot of things to wade through depending upon their background and their experience, which is why I think the deconstruction process is so important and not encouraged. Every side, it feels like, is destination oriented.
Yeah.
If you're not this, you're this. If you're this, then you're not this. And it's hard as a real person being in the middle of that.
Yeah. The whole polemic, like reality or nature of, I don't know. When we talk about public discourse, it's like a debate, right? It is always, and to me, these are like stemming to massive issues, right? Like, this is like global capitalism, consumerism, all these things that kind of create this dynamic of ultimately black and white. Well, you believe this, you believe that. Not because that's what it is, but because that's what sells advertising or, all that kind of conversation. So yeah, it feels like, if you get like a hardcore conservative, hardcore liberal, like they just have different talking points, but the way that they hold their view is exactly the same, right? And I feel like that can happen in faith circles, of course, too. And so that holding that middle space or that third way you guys have talked about, things like that, is difficult. It's so hard because you have such pressure, and unfortunately, I feel like the church just kind of decide, well, we'll react and we'll hold this ground over here against that.
And then we'll react to that reaction.
Right. And it just keeps going. And so some of the help I've found is when you start to engage in some of the more, people have been doing this third way thing for thousands of years, right? I mean, you have like the whole monastic communities, you have the mystics, and it's, we still have access to a lot of that stuff. Later today, I'm going to head up to a monastery where they still, I love you see it's a beautiful combination or integration where every day you have, 5 very, what I would call conservative prayer-like times of, there's a whole formula to it. It's very rigid, very structured to where, part of my more progressive side is like, well, that's kind of ridiculous. Like we should abandon that. But yet at the same time, the content of some of the prayer times that they have and who they allow to come up, they understand people are coming from, like, you don't even have to believe in a God, like just come, like they hold both well in tension. There's an integration there. And it's not like, I like to think of it, it's different than a balance. It's not like, well, you hold some of this and some of that. There's somehow a true like blending, not blending isn't even right. My mind's going now back to the class, like the theandric, like the reality of like how Jesus holds like the human and divine. But there's something like that really that happens in people. And I think, well, yeah, I mean, we have all these fun theological terms to try to figure out what that looks like in Jesus. But I think it's the same process of you end up with a tension inside of yourself. And from there, I think you either decide, I'm sick of this tension. And I just, it's easier to have, a black and white, or I've experienced a lot of pain in this tension. And so I need some time to rest in a more black and white.
I think that when we make everything black and white, or we say that there's this one mode to be in, that I think when we oversimplify anything, people are affected by it because it feels like they have to be either or. And I think a lot of the deconstruction things that we're talking about are obviously not exclusive to church. I mean, they're happening all over the place. When I was getting ready for this podcast and learning all the technical stuff, there are people out there that said, no, you should do this and use this mic and use this. And there are people that were very, nope, do it this way. And then others that were, nope, do it this way. And then there are people in the middle that said, here's some options. This works for this works for this, but whatever works for you. And I think that middle ground can be helpful in reconstructing because the bottom line is when we set a rigid structure, we devalue humanity, I think.
Yeah.
Because we don't allow for the complexities of who people are to shine and to work through and to process. Because you're right. Like one of the things that was really helpful for me, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but this book called Spiral Dynamics, and recognizing that within who we are, there are times where black and white is important. If I'm at a job where I'm doing paperwork or I'm an accountant, black and white structure, it's important because I need that. But that doesn't make all of who I am black and white. I can have other areas where I'm more open and freeing. And even someone in a religious situation who is very dogmatic in their theology, that doesn't mean that there's not areas of their life where there's freedom and there's a flowing way of looking at things. I've seen some beautiful art from people that, that you talk to them and it's hard to figure out, like, how do you even see beauty? Because sometimes the things you say are so ugly. But I think that recognition of the complexity of humans and leaving a space for that really helps in that process as well.
Yeah. A sense of journey, right? I mean, this is real popular, but that idea of, no, there is an appropriate time even. I mean, I feel like when you're growing up, I don't need to know the complex nuances of faith or of particular things when I'm like 7. I mean, I think there are ways in which we can do a better job of preparing people to be able to open up to more mystery. And that's just built in already at some level, I guess. But there are times in life where, if there's a kind of an overarching journey that we go through, we would expect that, things might start out a particular way and then move. And so I feel like what's damaging is when, and this can happen in any church, whether it's a bunch of old people in a church, a bunch of young people in a church, like whatever it is. And this is why I think churches need to be multi-generational, is because you can end up thinking and viewing everything from your particular stage of life. And so this is what's best for humanity. It's like, well, maybe that's best for when you're in between 23 and 29 or when you're in your mid 30s or whatever. But hey, when you have 3 kids and a mortgage and this and this and this, you might want a little more stability about this particular thing, and that doesn't mean it's right necessarily, but it doesn't just create space for in the moment here in our right now in the 21st century, this is where we need to be. But it says, well, in addition to that, nuanced, when you're 4, this probably doesn't matter, or this is helpful, and this is good. So I think we need to think about it, of course, at all levels, but make space for, when you're hanging out with the 85-year-old, I don't need them to all of a sudden have this, crazy different worldview that's going to accept all the new changes that are coming, because they've done that.
So for you, kind of on a closing note, what would you say to someone that is in the deconstruction process right now? Like what things would you pull out from what we've talked about, or maybe something we didn't mention that might be helpful for someone who's trying to figure out how to rebuild something?
I'm all for rebuilding, and I just think you do it in a different way, and you hold it loosely. So, like, you don't have to replace what was gone with something new. I mean, the thing I wish I could tell a bunch of my friends and people that I know who have, in some ways, walked outside of their, walked away from what they consider faith, is like they didn't. Is it like, do it with it? I don't know. I see, like, there's faith is bigger. Like, I get frustrated. Like, I have friends who I think, like, the way that we think, the way that we operate in the world, what we believe about humanity, what we believe about, like, kind of the trajectory of where humanity is going, and what I would say where I think God is going, are almost identical. And yet, because of some of their experiences, they've had to step outside of the faith community. And I wish there was a way to convey, like, without, I don't want to be demeaning to them, but I'd say, like, you can still be in. Like, where you're at is totally acceptable within. And it was by encountering people who were able to say that to me. Like, oh no, as you're rebuilding something, you can rebuild it, but I almost feel like it doesn't have to be at the exclusion of something. So, like, go ahead, rebuild, reconstruct. And I mean, maybe that's what I would say to people is just don't stop at the deconstruction. Start to rebuild and realize that what you're rebuilding may get knocked over again, but you don't have to be as attached to it as you were before.
And I would also add to that, finding some way, shape, or form to allow yourself to rebuild independent of the hurt that's left over from your deconstruction process, especially if you encounter negatively people within the church or whatever organization you're a part of that you're kind of challenging or questioning. And I know that that's a difficult thing, and we've advocated in the past on the show, finding someone to help, finding a counselor or talking to someone about some of those issues. Because I think for us, probably partly to do with the fact that we're 2 white males,
right,
and you're less questioned. But then also just partly because of our growing up, like, our deconstruction has been the result of, this is what we believed, we didn't believe it, and our local church may or may not believe the things that we're constructing. We've never had to deal with systematic issues that people, that I can't even fathom how difficult that would be. And then also making sure that you're surrounded by people that allow you to question and not be offended, and that give you options and not narrow choices, like do this or do that.
Yeah. I was just going to say what you're like, to me, there are people who have been forced to do the deconstruction. I mean, who the deconstruction has been done to them. And I say they're great people for us to learn from. Find books by people. There's a book I just found. I don't know if this needs to go in or not, but called "Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys." And it's this Native American or First Nation people guy from Canada who's describing what it's like for his own faith journey. And I feel like, those are the people that we need to, like, learn from about how do we reconstruct, and not just stay in my kind of white privileged, I can just handle deconstruction because all the other systems that I'm not deconstructing, they support me anyway, so I don't really have to worry about that. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's as good of a place as any. That's as good of a place as any to close our conversation out. So if you'd like to add to the conversation, share your story, or question some of the things that we said, you can do that at the show notes at irenicast.com/20. And there you'll also find informational links for some of the books that we mentioned for this week's topics. And don't forget, every Wednesday we'll have our Facebook question of the week related to this conversation. This week, on the other side of the music, we will be playing another round of Judging a Book by Its Cover, Movie Edition. All right, so this week we are doing a segment that we did, I think we did it in episode 7, called Judging a Book by Its Cover. And in the first time we did it, Each of us came up with a couple book titles, and then the others had to guess the synopsis of it. And this time we're going to do movie edition. So I guess we should call it Judging a Movie by its title, but for consistency's sake, we're judging a book by its cover, //, movie edition.
Nice.
So each of us have come up with a movie title, and the others will try to guess what the movie is about. So, Adam, why don't you go ahead and go first? Guess first, right?
Yes. Okay, I'll try. I'm a little nervous that you may know all of these, Jeff, because we're very similar in our tastes. So I chose movies that I've actually seen.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
So, this is another level for me here. Okay. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension.
Oh, I just heard about that movie on one of the nerdy podcasts that I listen to as something I should watch, but I haven't gotten around to doing it. So I'm going to try to recall what exactly... It was an 80s movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because they mentioned that they might be doing like a show or something, or a movie related to it, or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. I think maybe it's about a kid who goes on various misadventures who may or may not have some kind of superpower.
Yeah, that's not it at all.
Okay.
It's not bad. The movie's actually quite wild. A little bit more crazy than that. The main character is a neurosurgeon and a rock star. It has a band and probably numerous other things. In the beginning of the movie, they're able to somehow go into a mountain. Like he drives his car at a certain speed with some sort of flux capacitor kind of thing, and they go into the matter somehow of the mountain. And when they come out the other side, they've somehow drawn something in from the eighth dimension. And it's got an amazing, amazing cast. And so then it's like, what do they do with this kind of like 3 or 4 aliens that are there? John Lithgow is in it, and he is like one of the main aliens. Crazy. It's some of his best performance. You just like YouTube some of his stuff. It's classic. Jeff Goldblum's in it, wearing chaps the whole time.
Jeff Goldblum. You had me at Jeff Goldblum in chaps right there.
And then there's a scene that you need to look for of a double sax playing person, like the band. He has 2 saxophones in his mouth and he's playing at the same time.
Oh, man.
Anyway, some epic stuff from the movie. It's fantastic.
It is 80s. Jeff Goldblum had some good movies in the 80s. Did you ever see Transylvania 5000?
I did not.
It is a great movie. He basically plays a journalist who goes to Transylvania and is, as like a fluff piece, I think. And he encounters like all the monsters of Transylvania, like Frankenstein, all that kind of stuff, and kind of figures out what's going on behind the scenes. And the butler in the movie is Michael Richards, who plays Kramer.
Nice.
Plays this really like Romanian, quirky. There's a lot of Kramer-esque things in it. But yeah, there's a great movie. You should check it out.
Fantastic.
All right. So unlike you, I have not seen any of these movies. I was just looking for weird titles. So my first one is The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing.
Oh yeah, this is classic. Late 70s, early 80s. An older man. He's in his 80s, and he actually trains. I don't know why they call it cats. He actually trains small hamsters to dance, and it's kind of the slow story of him dying alone in a garage, I believe.
I appreciate the confidence you had in putting out that very wrong synopsis of this movie. So The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing is a Western about a defiant wife who leaves her husband to take up riding with outlaws.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And it's got Burt Reynolds in it.
Oh,
He's on the cover.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Is he one of the cats? How does the cat thing fit in?
I don't know.
I mean, it's a type of
I think
dance.
maybe it's like a somewhat misogynistic, like cat fight kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe. I haven't seen the movie, but it was done in the late 70s, so you got that part right.
I got the decade right. Nice.
I think it was 78 or something. All right, do you got another one?
I do. Undercover Blues.
I think I may know this one. I want to say it's with Dennis Quaid and Kathleen Turner.
Nice.
And they're undercover agents, and they have a kid.
That's right.
And they have to figure out how to balance espionage and family.
So great. Yeah, you nailed it. That was good. This is like the equivalent of like in horse or whatever when you play in basketball, like we have to make the shot. Like that was like for me that was like you're standing right next to the hoop, and sometimes like it's too close. Like people are like, oh, this is an easy shot, and they do it. So, but you nailed it. That was perfect. Well done.
So you were hoping it was so easy that I'd get it wrong.
Well, yeah, you'd be like, oh, it can't be that. but well done. Yeah, Stanley Tucci is in that and is brilliant. He is so hilarious. He plays like a guy that's like a, like call it, where he, like a street hustler kind of guy or whatever, named Muerte, and he has this really terrible accent through the whole thing.
I need to check that out. I remember seeing it on cable as a kid from time to time and thinking, I need to watch that because I like Dennis Quaid, because I was a huge fan of Inner Space when I was younger. Love that movie.
That was another movie that was on my list.
Oh, really? Oh, good.
It totally was.
Okay, that's good. All right, so my last one is this. The title is Life is Cheap, but Toilet Paper is Expensive.
Oh, man. I feel like this came up on my Netflix stream or something as a suggested watch. No, it didn't. Life is cheap,
but toilet paper is expensive. There's even a ... so you got to pause. Life is cheap,
but ...
but toilet paper is expensive.
Okay, so the but comes after the ... because that
Yes.
kind of changes the Life is cheap, but... Okay, here we go. Small town mortuary. The story of a family struggling to make ends meet through the whole mortuary business, and instead they toss it all and start a like Charmin. It's the history. It's actually a documentary on the history of the how Charmin came to be. Charmin. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. The little cuddly bear things. Charmin.
I always thought that disconcerting to watch a cartoon bear with toilet paper stuck to its butt.
Right, they're just like, they get really into it too. It's like, oh, this
They
is
really
so soft. That's it, right?
That is so it. No, that is not it. This is the synopsis I pulled from IMDb. It says a man is hired by a group of people he believes to be gangsters to escort a briefcase from America to Hong Kong. When he arrives, however, his contract is nowhere to be found and no further instructions. He decides to take in the sights of Hong Kong, which consist of him taking part in a great deal of blood, sex, and general weirdness, all while wearing a briefcase handcuffed to his arm.
General weirdness. This is one of
General
those,
weirdness.
clearly, like, when they translated it from the whatever, like, original, I'm sure the original title makes more sense, maybe. Or maybe not.
Maybe. There was, it might be a translate. I got the sense that it was a Hong Kong film.
Like, is there an idiom in there somewhere, maybe, that just doesn't quite fit our,
Maybe.
Like
Maybe
life
because
is
of
cheap
like
thing.
importing taxes,
There
toilet
you
paper
go.
really is expensive.
No, it's true. Maybe it's just a commentary on the process of getting the movie to American viewers.
There was one movie when I was researching this that talked about like how the actual title of the movie ended up being "We'll figure out a title later." There's something along those lines.
In B.J. Novak's new book, or his book that he put out, there's a great like short story about like John Grisham's like new book or whatever, and it's called like whatever, or it's like some title. I can't remember what it's called, dang it. But something like that where it's a filler and then it becomes, and it's the whole process of his like being frustrated that they didn't realize that was clearly not the title. It's pretty funny. You have to read that, B.J. Novak.
That's good. I'll check that out. Yeah, there's a lot of weird titles for movies, but these ones in particular stood out to me. And obviously, it's kind of rigging the game. I wonder if we should make that a rule going forward that we've had to read or watch the movie. But nah,
It's more fun.
It's
I
more
think,
fun
randomly.
this way. Yeah, because now I kind of want to see both of these movies,
Well, sure. Yeah.
especially the Life is Cheap but Toilet Paper is Expensive.
No. Oh man. I'm imagining like a total like old boy kind of scenario or whatever. He just like wakes up and he has this briefcase, and 50 years later.
Yeah, I feel like that could be the plot for Hangover 4.
Yeah, there it is.
Right
If you're
there.
listening,
Yeah,
whoever
Hangover
makes those
4,
movies.
a remake of Life is Cheap but Toilet Paper is
Yeah.
Expensive.
Zach Galifianakis, come on, hook us up.
I feel like that's a line he could deliver with.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, so I think that'll do it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. And if you like what you hear and you'd like to support the show, please, you can do that best by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps people be able to find the show if they're searching through any of those things. Also, tell a friend and contact us anytime on our feedback page at irenicast.com/feedback. And there you'll find all the ways in which you can like, follow, stalk, love, all the stuff to us. Contact us.
This is falling apart at the end
I know,
here.
right?
This is what happens when Mona and Alan aren't here.
I know, right? It all just falls apart. So let me try that again. Contact us anytime on our feedback page at irenicast.com/feedback. And there you will find all the ways you can contact us, like us, follow us, all that good stuff. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I am not Mona or Alan. I am Adam.
Thanks for joining the conversation.